Many times, new financial regulations are reactive to a big scandal or a big crisis in the market. Accounting scandals led to Sarbanes Oxley, and the financial crisis led to Dodd-Frank. While these regulations are meant to solve a problem such as fraud or irresponsible lending, a lot of times these regulations have side effects that enhance or change an entire industry. Well, recently on August 23rd, 2023, the SEC came out with new regulations on the private equity industry. What are those new regulations? And what will be the resulting side effects? Well, you'll have to watch this video to find out. In this video, we will talk about Sarbanes Oxley and its effect on the private equity industry, Dodd-Frank and its effect on the private equity industry, and we will talk about the new 2023 SEC private equity regulations, including my predictions on the resulting side effects on the private equity industry. And we'll end the video with a final thought. So let's get started with Sarbanes Oxley. In the early 2000s, what company had a market cap of approximately $70 billion and within 2 years filed for bankruptcy protection? Any idea? It was Enron. And what was the main cause of this collapse? It was accounting fraud. When a stock like Enron goes from approximately $70 billion to $0, a lot of investors lose money, and regulators probably should do something about it. And that's what happened in 2002. After the accounting scandals with Enron, WorldCom, and a few others, a new regulation called the Sarbanes Oxley Act was put into place. The result of the act was the new requirements for actions and disclosures, mostly targeted at public companies. These actions, such as increased liability for certain officers of the company, and disclosures such as additional reporting requirements, were successful since they helped accomplish the goal of reducing accounting fraud. But wait, there was a side effect. Do you know what that side effect was? The side effect of Sarbanes-Oxley was that it helped grow the private equity industry. Let me explain. These newly required actions and disclosures for public companies were very costly. This resulted in a lot of public companies becoming private and in a lot of private companies staying private longer. This is a big contributor to the large growth in the private equity industry since 2002. Now let's move on to Dodd-Frank. In 2008, there was a financial crisis, but not just any financial crisis, one that is referred to with the acronym GFC. You know what that stands for? Of course you do. It's the global financial crisis. In the years leading up to the global financial crisis, interest rates, inflation rates, and unemployment rates were low, and economic growth was strong. This led to quite a lot of risk-taking, which included aggressive lending practices by banks. Many of these loans were given as mortgages, which led to a housing crisis. Just like in 2002 after the Enron collapse, the regulators stepped in. This time, it wasn't with the goal of reducing accounting fraud, but with the goal of getting banks to be less risky, as well as a few other things. So in 2010, the Dodd-Frank Act was introduced and put quite a lot of restrictions on bank lending. But there was still demand from companies for loans. So how were loans given to companies if the banks were restricted from giving these loans? That's right. Someone else gave the loans. So, who? It was the private debt funds, which either already existed or were newly created, mostly by private equity firms. Fun fact, these private debt funds were mainly used to lend on private equity deals. So the loans on private equity deals didn't stop because of the restriction. They were just provided by a different source. The new regulations had the side effect of creating a large private debt industry. So Sarbanes-Oxley and Dodd-Frank had a side effect that helped the private equity industry as a whole. Now let's move on to the new 2023 SEC private equity regulations. There are quite a few complaints about the private equity industry. Some are valid and some are not. The question is, did the SEC need to come up with new regulations? Well, I guess it all depends on how you answer the following questions. Number one, are there enough disclosure requirements in the industry? Number two, should some investors get preferential treatment? And number three, should conflicts of interest be reduced in secondaries? To better understand the conflicts of interest in secondaries, please check out our video titled LP-led and GP-led private equity secondaries. There are lots of other questions as well, but these are my top three. Well, the SEC believed that, number one, there were not enough disclosure requirements in the industry. Number two, some investors were getting too much preferential treatment through side letters, which many times weren't disclosed. And number three, for certain secondary transactions, there should be an additional independent opinion provided by an independent opinion provider. So, on August 23rd, 2023, the SEC came out with new regulations on the private equity industry that included, number one, requiring additional disclosures through quarterly statements with specific information. Number two, creating additional rules to reduce, or some cases eliminate, preferential treatment to large investors. And number three, requiring an independent opinion on secondary transactions with the intention to reduce conflicts of interest. The SEC document is over 600 pages long, and there are a lot more details than I'm giving here because I only have so much time. But if you're interested in reading the document yourself, I have put the link to the document in the description below. Now, what will be the side effects of this regulation? Well, it's too early to tell, but I'm happy to share my thoughts. I believe that the biggest side effect of this regulation will come from the additional disclosures. So I'll come back to this topic later in the video. When it comes to preferential treatment and secondary transactions, I would assume that the industry will find a way around these rules in a similar way to how the industry figured out how to get loans through the private debt channel after Dodd-Frank restricted banks from giving certain loans. For preferential treatment, I don't think it will be difficult for private equity funds to find other ways to offer preferential treatment to large influential investors. With that said, I think the SEC rules do a good job to level the playing field when it comes to certain investors receiving preferential information about the fund. Since before the time of this document, there are cases when certain investors have access to a lot more portfolio holding information than other investors. There are more specifics to this rule, but I'll leave it there for now. For secondary transactions, well, I guess it all depends on how independent the independent opinion will be. I really hope this can be enforced for the sake of the industry. But seeing how independent opinions are in other industries, I'm not sure how optimistic I am that this will actually happen. Okay, So let's get back to the new disclosure requirements. I believe that the increased disclosure requirements are well intended. After all, I wouldn't describe the private equity industry as the most honest industry on the planet. And I'm not sure when reporting that ethics outweigh the financial benefit, but maybe it does sometimes. With that said, I believe this regulation will have a large unintended side effect. Let me explain. The increased disclosure requirements will be expensive for smaller funds. These funds usually have low margins, if any profit at all, and will be challenged by the increased expenses with the new disclosures. Now, we have seen this with the ESG requirements in Europe. There are small funds that pass all of the requirements to become an Article 9 fund, but because of additional costs, these funds can't afford, they have to settle to be an Article 8 fund. Now, for ESG in Europe, while there are different requirements to be classified as Article 8 and Article 9, if a fund doesn't meet the requirements of an Article 9 fund, it can still exist. The fund just can't say it's an Article 9 fund. I am concerned that the new 2023 SEC regulations will have a more dramatic impact because these are requirements for the fund to exist. So in the event this becomes costly and the fund can't afford it, well, they don't have another option. So if this rule is sustained in the future, I believe we will see a lot more consolidation in the industry, and I believe that a lot fewer small firms will exist. This could have the opposite of the intended effect of helping investors. If there are fewer private equity firms, and these firms are large, the bargaining power of the private equity firms will actually increase, which would ultimately hurt investors. Now, here's a final thought. Investors, regulators usually mean well. They are well-intentioned and they are trying to serve your best interests as investors. I understand why Sarbanes Oxley was created. It had many positive effects. I understand why Dodd-Frank was created. It also had many positive effects. And I understand why the new 2023 SEC private equity regulations were created. And I can see many of the positive effects as well. But when you see new regulation, don't just read the regulation to understand it. Read the regulation to figure out what side effect will occur and what industries will be affected. Every rule will have a side effect that may fuel a boom in the private equity industry, such as with Sarbanes-Oxley, give rise to a large private debt industry, such as with Dodd-Frank. And hopefully I'm wrong, but it could create a consolidated private equity industry with oligopolistic behaviors with these new private equity regulations.